Hello, everybody. If you can take your seats. This is usually the best part of a Philanthropy New York annual meeting, is the chance for everybody to get together and to talk. But I really think that this year we have an event that's going to be just as good as all of the mingling and the networking. So if you're lingering in the back, come on down and come take a seat. I'm Brandy McHale. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the City Foundation, and I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome you all today to City's headquarters here in New York City, and want to thank Philanthropy in New York for this opportunity to host the 33rd annual meeting. For those of you that aren't as familiar with our work here, our mission at the City Foundation is to invest in the financial inclusion and economic empowerment of households and communities where we do business. And in 2012, we'll be making grants in 91 countries around the globe. Our objective, like many of you, is not to simply fund programs that align with our mission, but to actually invest in efforts that catalyze innovation, build knowledge about what works, and scale successful efforts so we can reach millions of households and place them on the path to financial stability and economic success. I know as I look around the room here that I'm actually preaching to the choir when I say that this quest for innovation and scale can't be accomplished through philanthropy alone. And it is critical that we leverage both private markets and public sector systems to ensure access and inclusion for all. So when a few months ago we received the call from Philanthropy New York indicating the focus of this year's annual meeting, we were thrilled for the chance to host this forum and dialogue with education leaders who are on the cutting edge of innovation and catalyzing system change approaches with the potential to transform the educational and economic trajectory of an entire generation of young people. I have to confess to all of you that even though one of our biggest U.S. grant-making efforts is a college planning and advisement demonstration that offers match savings accounts for low-income families committed to getting their kids to and through college, this actually isn't why it took us about 30 seconds to say yes and to lock in this opportunity to host all of you today. We said yes right away because Philanthropy New York is such an important institution in the field of U.S. philanthropy. And it is truly an honor to host any dialogue that they spark and lead. I should say that we spark and lead because it is a membership organization. And let alone to host a conversation important to our country's future. Personally, I've had the honor of serving as a two-term board member at Philanthropy New York many, many years ago. And it's been thrilling to watch the organization's evolution and growth since that time. For us, Philanthropy New York is synonymous with innovation, best practice, and partnership. And we want to salute you and the entire membership on this important occasion. And thank you for allowing us to be part of both your history and your future. So let's begin today's discussion, and I'd like to call up Doug Bauer, Philanthropy New York's current board chair, to kick us off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. One more time, good afternoon. All right. The educators want to know that you're out there. Okay. Thank you, Brandy, and thank you again, City, for hosting us today. My name is Doug Bauer. I'm the Executive Director of the Clark Foundation. I'm outgoing board chair, but in my final act, I get to introduce this session today. And on behalf of the board and staff of Philanthropy New York, we're really pleased that you're here. And for those of you watching via the streaming on the web, we welcome you as well. It's my pleasure to kick this off. This enhanced annual meeting, this is the largest annual meeting we've ever had, is not something that occurred by happenstance. One key component of the strategic plan that guides Philanthropy New York in its work is a commitment to deeper engagement in public policy as it relates to the issues our members care about. We have formed a public policy committee of some of the philanthropic leadership in the city to advise the board, the staff, and membership of Philanthropy New York on where it should look for intersections between the role of philanthropic investment and government action. Moving forward, this work will be essential. Broadly speaking, and over the next number of years, government funding will become finite. a point that David Firestone made painfully clear in the session prior to this one. And that will be especially so at the state and local level. Our taxpayer dollars are going to be stretched, so too will be the philanthropic dollars entrusted to us in the audience. In this great country of ours, we've relied on a complex balance of resources in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to deliver services and programs to all strata of our community. Going forward, how we will achieve that will be tested like never before. A real need for donors, funders, and grant makers to be engaged like never before on the question of public-private partnerships and how will they help do things like sustain the social safety net, provide access to arts and culture, nurture and sustain the environment, and so on. But in my mind, this exploration of the public-private partnership has never been more dynamic than in the area of public education. Mayor Bloomberg's time in office has been an exciting era of reform, and philanthropic dollars have fueled and underwritten some of the boldest work. Nonprofits like KIP, Achievement First, Commissioner King's former employer, and Common Schools, Harlem Success Academies, New Visions for New Schools, Urban Assembly, and I have to insert my personal favorite model, the Bard Early College High School, have demonstrated what is truly possible in classrooms in 1,500 public schools across the city. But with less than 600 days to go in Mayor Bloomberg's tenure, where do we go from here? Not an unimportant question when we think about something former Chancellor Joel Klein once said, and I quote, "We can't hope to really fix poverty until we fix public education." That and other questions are the real focus of today's discussion. And indeed, today's discussion was framed by Philanthropy New York's Education Working Group, co-chaired by Fred Freelow of the Ford Foundation and my colleague Rich McKeon of the Helmsley Trust. This group of funders, along with input we received from parents, teachers, and education reform leaders, helped to shape the discussion that will be guided by Beth Fertig, the education reporter at WNYC Radio. The board is grateful to Fred and Rich for their invaluable leadership and work on today's session. Fred and Rich, can you stand up and be acknowledged, please? I also want to acknowledge Suzanne Immerman from the U.S. Department of Education. I don't think the Secretary would have showed up unless we started to work with Suzanne on making this happen. So, Suzanne, where are you? Are you here? I know she's here. There she is. Thank you, Suzanne. And Secretary Duncan, we appreciate you listening to Suzanne, so thank you. All right. So now let me get off the stage, and I will let the ed reform equivalent of the three tenors take over. As I noted just a moment ago, we are delighted to have Beth Fertig here in person as opposed to being in your radio. Beth has been a great partner in developing this session, and she will do a super job interacting with our three distinguished guests. So thank you all, and Beth, it's all yours.
Thank you. So the big question that a lot of you were asking is this the first time these three have done an event together? And I confirm that it is, in fact. So not exactly, you know, the rock star reunion, but in education circles, perhaps it is. And I worked with the folks here at Philanthropy in New York to come up with questions that would reflect your interests. But of course, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll do my best. So the first thing that a lot of people were really curious about was the phrase 21st century skills. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Education Secretary, because we keep hearing about the need to get more students ready for college and careers with these 21st century skills. What are they?
A couple things, and actually it's sort of common sense, but unfortunately it's been more the exception than the norm. The ability to think critically, the ability to solve problems, the ability to work in diverse teams, and the ability to be a lifelong learner. I mean, there are probably several others we could add to it, but it's those basic things that employer after employer, CEO after CEO that I meet with are looking for, and unfortunately far too few people are knocking on their doors with those skills.
But those seem so basic. Why are those 21st century skills?
Maybe they're 20th and 19th as well, but you know, I think obviously we're moving from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge-based economy, and having folks have the skills to think on their feet, to solve problems, to continue to learn. We've had more of a factory model of education historically, and that has to fundamentally change. So while it sounds obvious and easy, that has not been the norm historically in New York or in the country. And that's why, again, I think we're pushing for radical change, because that's what the new economy looks like.
So that brings in the Common Core standards that you may have heard of. It's a kind of wonky term. It's an educator's term to say states are pushing for Common Core standards. New York joined 46 other states in the District of Columbia in adopting these Common Core standards. Can you and our New York State Education Commissioner John King perhaps explain what are the Common Core standards? What does it mean for teachers and for students? What's different? Because there's a lot of trends in education, but Common Core, what does that really mean?
Sure. Well, what's unique about the Common Core standards is, unlike past standards efforts, these standards were developed actually by mapping backwards from college and career success. So rather than saying that here's what a kindergartner should know, and a first grader should know a little bit more, and a second grader should know a little bit more than that, these standards started with, what do you need to be successful in college and careers? And then what are the implications for what you need to know in 10th grade, 7th grade, all the way back? And they really, what's challenging is they require a change in instruction. So to get at the skills that the secretary described, you need to ask students to do things differently. So for example, the level of complexity of text that students are asked to read has to be much higher. So we have to have kids reading more challenging books. The kinds of writing that we ask students to do has to be different. We have to ask students to write with evidence from sources. So rather than just writing reflective personal essays, which are still important, we know for college and career success, you need to be able to make an argument, cite evidence from primary source documents, from research. In math, we know that too often in the United States, we've had a math curriculum that moves you through topics, just one after the other, a week and a half at a time, and never really achieves the kinds of deep understanding that students need to apply those math skills. And so the Common Core focuses on a smaller set of skills that are truly fundamental for success at the next level of mathematics. And at the department, we're working on building resources to support teachers in making those instructional shifts. We've built a website, engageny.org, that's designed to provide professional development materials, video exemplars of great teaching that will help teachers implement the Common Core effectively.
One thing people wanted to know was how to communicate this, and I think it might help if you could explain, is the research behind the things that you're pushing for? Do we know that these efforts are going to be more successful than things people have tried in the past?
So there are three bodies of research that we're focused on. One is what do higher education faculty and employers say students need to be successful when they enter? That was the first body of research. Second, what are our international competitors doing, and what can we learn from them that they're doing better than we are, so that we can help catch up with them as we see them outperforming us in some of the sort of international benchmarks. And then some of the work is based on research about student learning. So for example, one thing we know about early grades is that students who know more about science and social studies and the world tend to be better readers. And yet in a lot of schools, we've narrowed the curriculum just to English language arts and left out history and science. And so the Common Core calls for us to bring those back and make sure that students have that breadth of knowledge that will help them be successful readers.
So a question for our schools chancellor, Dennis Walcott. Have you seen a real role then for private philanthropy, for foundations to assist in implementing the Common Core? Are there certain practices that you think make the most sense for foundations to assist with?
I see extremely an important role for private philanthropy to play, and quite frankly, here in this audience, many of the individuals and corporations and foundations have played a significant role both in New York City and I imagine the state and also the federal government in allowing us to experiment, allowing us to use monies that are not city tax levy dollars to do the deeper dive that John talked about, to allow us to deal with teacher effectiveness and what it actually means. And to me, I want to go back to a point that you asked the Secretary about. I mean, I think the difference now versus before is a global economy. Back when I was growing up and around as a student, it was more of a national and local economy. You had, if you were a high school dropout, potentially an opportunity to get a job. Right now, if you're a high school dropout, you probably don't have that opportunity. You're a high school graduate, your ability is there, but your earning power will be less. And what we're seeing now is a competition from across the world as far as these jobs are concerned. And we have a responsibility, both as a country, a state, and a city, to prepare our students to be able to think critically, as John talked about, to be able to analyze and be able to write and work as colleagues, and even more importantly, have the ability to really focus on how to apply today's skills in a way that benefits them in the long run. And I think what private philanthropy has done has given us in New York City that ability to do that and starting new programs to allow us to have, I think, Common Core really spread in a very deep way with our workforce. As you may know, that for the start of the school year, we decided to, instead of having a school day, we had a professional development day. We're always looking on how we enhance our professional development for the teachers to meet the goals set both by the state and the federal government. And private philanthropy has really been very effective in helping us do that.
But are there specific programs that you've researched that you think are most
So
effective? How do you know what to support and when to cut your losses?
So we have, I think, a very thriving research and development team, and we do a lot of innovation at the Department of Education and working in conjunction with the state to see what works, what doesn't work, but most importantly, to experiment. So we have our innovation zone, and as a result of our innovation zone, through the funding, through a number of people in this room, we're able to do a lot of creative things and look at different school models. Take a look at the school year in a different way, take a look at teaching and learning in a different way, and allow that to really go out to see how it works and then analyze it using technology like never before. So using both the staff who are there, but also the technology that needs to be addressed as well, and that type of integration as far as learning is concerned, and seeing what works and then what doesn't work. I think one of the things you talked about the mayor earlier, I think what the mayor has been very big in is around innovation and making sure through our partnerships with private philanthropy, we have a lot of innovation taking place in the system, whether it's the Common Core implementation, whether it's teacher effectiveness, or a program that some of us were talking about earlier today when I got here was the Summer Quest program, where we're developing an initiative with community-based organizations to prevent summer learning loss, or our DREAM initiative to prepare more students for specialized high school students from poor backgrounds. All that is as a result of private philanthropy giving us our ability to do that.
So as we move into this new phase of education reform that we're calling Common Core, the tests are not going away. And this has been a question that a lot of people are concerned about because the role of testing has grown so much, especially since No Child Left Behind. And I guess the question is, how do we build better tests? Would you like to tackle that?
I would love to, but John's actually helping to lead that effort nationally. And to be really clear, just as with the Common Core, this next generation of assessments is really state-led. And if we do at the federal level that dies, it doesn't work. We're a big investor here at $350 million, but literally all of the leadership is coming from the state level, and John and New York are one of the key players in driving this next generation of assessments. So John, why don't you walk through what you're doing?
Sure. So one of the things that the federal government did was create a race to the top assessment competition with two consortia that won, who are collections of states who've committed to build next generation assessments. New York is one of those. We're part of the PARC consortium that's working to build next generation assessments. And two of the operating principles for that assessment design work, one is we've got to build assessments that do a better job measuring exactly the skills that the Common Core requires. So if we want to encourage teachers to do more writing with evidence, we've got to ask questions on the assessments that require students to provide evidence in support of their arguments. If we want teachers to focus their math instruction on application and opportunities for students to apply their math skills to challenging problems, that's what they've got to see on the assessments. So that's one operating principle. The other is that there's technology that we ought to take advantage of in designing the next generation of assessments. And so the goal is to launch new assessments in 2014-15 that will be delivered as computer-based tests. And so that will give us the opportunity to have more innovative items, to ask students to create mathematical models on the screen, to have students type their essays rather than write their essays, to be able to make the sort of edits that they'd have to make in the workplace to their writing. The other challenge is how do we make sure we see these shifts in instruction before we get to those assessments? And so one of the things that we're doing in New York is redesigning our existing assessment system to align better with the Common Core, even in the form of paper and pencil tests. And so starting in 2012-13, our state tests will begin to reflect the Common Core. It won't be all that we can achieve through the PARC effort, but you'll see that focus on conceptual understanding of mathematics. You'll see a higher text complexity level and in English language arts, more rigorous reading and writing for students.
There was, I guess you could call it a loss of confidence this year, though, in the state exams because of a few test questions that had to be thrown out, including the infamous talking pineapple on the 8th grade English language arts exam. It was a question that a lot of students and teachers didn't understand, and it turned out that the testing company had actually used the same question before in previous states, and there was a Facebook page about this test question that was created by students in other states who were equally stumped by it a couple of years ago. Do you think the public is losing confidence, though, when they see that you're saying these test questions are not going to count the first year that you have a contract with a new testing company? Pearson is the provider. How do you convince the public that you're going the right way when they see that there's been some problems on this year's tests?
Well, a couple things. I think one is you see the environment has shifted around assessments where the tenor of the discourse is so acrimonious, and there is such a sort of gotcha culture around assessment, in part because we are asking more of the assessment system. And so that's something that we have to be mindful of at the state level. Test publishers, whether it's Pearson or CTB, McGraw-Hill or others, have to be mindful of that. The choice of what reading passages to use is exactly what the Common Core tries to get at, making sure that we're choosing passages that are rigorous, that are going to challenge students to think critically, that are going to force students to provide good evidence for their arguments. And then there are some things that Pearson just didn't do as well as they should have, and we're going to make sure that they do going forward. They're a vendor like any other, and they've got to be accountable for their performance.
If I may, I think we have to be very careful, though, in that we live in a tabloid society, unfortunately. And I think we have a responsibility to have discussions like we're having today around what John talked about, because that is the direction of where we're going as a system. And I think the state got really knocked around in a way that wasn't fair to the state. Yes, they had challenges and issues, and John and the Board of Regents responded appropriately and very hard around this needs to be changed, but at the same time, the overall message was lost. And I think we have a responsibility as a group to convey exactly what John was talking about as far as the changing design of assessments and what it means to our society, what it means to our children as they grow up to be adults. And we have to have that type of intellectual discussion on a constant basis. And we have a responsibility to engage our parents in that discussion as well, because our parents are very capable of understanding that discussion. And if we allow just a headline or a question to dominate it, then I think it undermines the goals that all are trying to achieve. And we, as the leaders of our respective systems, cannot allow that to happen at all.
You mentioned that the U.S. government is funding these initiatives to change the testing that Mr. King is a part of. Do you feel, and what sort of checks do you put in to make sure that the tests are better designed in the states? You must be hearing this around the country. I read Broward County, Florida. Their school board voted to convince the state to not make the tests count as much for rating teachers in schools. There isn't so much emphasis on testing. How do you work as the federal government to make sure that the states are designing the right tests with the money you give them?
Well, let me back up. I think there's a more fundamental point, is I think under No Child Left Behind, there was frankly way too much emphasis on one test. I think that's what you're really getting a pushback from, I think in a very legitimate way, from students, from parents, from teachers. And when there's so much emphasis on just one test and a proficiency cut score, I think you create a lot of perverse incentives that aren't good for children and good for education. So obviously we wanted Congress to fix No Child Left Behind. That didn't happen, so we've provided waivers to about 24 states so far, not quite, New York being one of them, and another 18 or 20 states to go, that you're looking at student growth each year. I think it's so important to look at growth and gain. I keep coming back, we have to look at multiple measures, whether you're evaluating children or teachers or principals or schools or districts or ultimately the state. If we're just focusing on one test score, I think that's a big, big problem. So I'm 100% convinced this next generation of assessments will be better, much better than what we have today. Will they be perfect? Absolutely not. Will they be better, even better 5 years from now? I hope so. We have in education letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to evolve, but we have to look at a whole set of factors. If we're much more holistic, if we stop just teaching to the test, if we stop doing English and math and do science and social studies and fine arts and dance and drama and foreign languages and PE, then our children start to have the kind of well-rounded education they deserve.
And yet, in a time of budget cuts, people do complain, though, that art and music and all these other programs are being cut because they have to focus on the basics. How do you provide for that?
Well, again, I think it's really understanding. If you want your children to do better in math, try some music. If you want our kids to sit and concentrate in class, try some recess, a little bit of time in the playground. And so, you know, I just speak from personal experience. I was one of those young boys, if I had to sit still for 6 hours, boy, I felt sorry for my teachers. If I had a chance to run around a little bit and burn up some steam, then I could sit there and concentrate. So it's being smart. We're all trying to get to the same goal. How we get there. Now, tough budget times, absolutely. No one loves tough budget times. These are very, very difficult times. Let's be real about that. But we can't let tough budget times be an excuse for perpetuating a status quo that is not working for young people. And I just sort of go back to the fundamental challenge. When I visited the state, just a couple quick numbers. You guys have, as a state, 250,000 ninth graders, 250,000. Any guesses how many 12th graders you guys have? The state? A little better than that, luckily, about 188. So this state is losing 62,000 young people every single year, 62,000. That's the goal. That's the enemy. We have one common enemy. How do we keep those 62,000 people in school, graduating, and ultimately graduating college and career ready? That's the battle we're all fighting together.
And you're still focusing on data, you know, now that districts, because of No Child Left Behind, started measuring their schools based on proficiency, there's more and more data. And they're tracking children from kindergarten through 12th grade. States are building data systems. And this gets back to the questions and the concerns about the tests that you hear, which is these tests, even though you say you don't want them to be just used as one test that's going to determine everything, they are being used, though, to determine whether schools are meeting certain marks, whether teachers are efficient and effective. And I guess one question that I've gotten was, how do you mitigate against the temptation that schools might feel to push out or suspend students who are not doing very well in school in order to boost their numbers?
So my mantra is multiple measures, multiple measures. And if all you're doing is evaluating a teacher or a school or a district on one test score, well, guess what? That's exactly what's going to happen. That's a rational behavior. But if you're looking at multiple things, including dropout rates, including graduation rates, including pulling students back in who have dropped out, not just 4-year graduation rates, but 5-year rates, trying to create incentives to bring in those struggling students, not disincentives to push them out. If you look at, are they graduating, are they going on to college after that, are they going on not needing remedial classes, if you have a much more holistic system of accountability and evaluation, then you change the incentive structure so you're not pushing out the kids who we should be trying to do everything we can to keep in our schools.
And you also develop the ability to see where that student is down the line. So the accountability is built in there. So you know where I'm at after the 12th grade. And we're building those measures in. I think that's another method of accountability, of seeing how well a school is doing. And going back to your earlier point around going beyond English language arts and math. I mean, I was at a program, I guess 2 weeks ago, where it was an art program. And they were having a celebration for 2 schools per borough, the LEAP program, LEAP art program. And they had painted lunchroom benches. And I was listening to the presentations of the students talking about their table and what it meant as far as the social issue of the day. And there was one school that really jumped off the page. And I could tell this school was incorporating Common Core in their arts presentation about this particular table. And I double-checked with the principal later on and found out that she did include that. And just listening to the students and their research and their evidence base that was connected to that and the way they were able to articulate. And while most of the schools talked for 2 minutes about their presentation, this particular school talked for 20 minutes. And they were able to analyze everything. And that, to me, is the infusion of Common Core across subject area and what it actually means. And then, as you know, we are able to build in here in New York City, and I know John has been talking about this as well, as far as how well a school is doing in their high school graduation rate. So now that's in our high school directory, and people will know that. Where is that student now post-graduation of that high school? And we'll be incorporating that into the 8th grade as far as where the student's at. And having those multiple measures in performance will give us the ability to not have the perverse type of incentive that you're talking about, but really having a longitudinal look of that particular student and how well that student is doing.
That's for rating schools. How about rating teachers? Do you think that the current formula that states are coming up with, which is anywhere from 30 to 40% of a teacher's rating is based on student test scores, is fair? Because we've seen examples in which, especially here in New York City, the Chancellor has acknowledged that the first time that New York City rated teachers solely with test scores, there were some problems.
Yes. So again, let's sort of look at where we are as a country. For decades, 0% of a teacher's evaluation was based upon whether their children were learning. 0%. In fact, we had states that had laws on the books, including, I think, New York, that actually prohibited the linking of student achievement and teacher evaluation. That makes no sense whatsoever. That's one extreme. The other extreme is 100% of a teacher's evaluation being based on a student test score, which also makes absolutely no sense. Go back to what I said before, multiple measures, looking at a set of different things. Student growth and gain being what we said was a significant part, and whether it's 30 or 20 or 40 or 50, the honest answer is we as a country don't know what the right percentage is there. But saying that teachers have an impact on student achievement, that's a really important statement to make about valuing the profession. Look at principal evaluation, look at peer evaluation, look at teacher leadership, look at student surveys. There's a whole host of data we should look at. Teacher evaluation in this country has been broken for decades. Hasn't broken for decades. And now we have a set of states, including New York, who are moving to a very different level. Is New York's system of evaluation going to be perfect? I promise you it won't be. I promise you it won't. But we have to, again, stop letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's evolve. Let's figure out what works and what doesn't. And 5 years from now, let's be at an entirely different level. When we say that great teaching doesn't matter, we demean the extraordinary teachers and principals that are making an amazing difference in our students' lives. And we've done that for far too long as a country. That paradigm has to change. In New York, I think it's helping lead the country where we need to go.
Quick question for all three of you on the teacher ratings. Should the ratings be released to the general public for everyone to see a teacher's rating?
I've really struggled on this, so I won't give you a flip answer. I really challenged the situation a couple of years ago in Los Angeles, and the context there, which just drove me crazy, is that they had this data and the teachers themselves didn't have access to it. It was like mind-boggling to me. So information about, were you reaching, not whether I was teaching, but whether my children were actually learning what I was teaching, somehow teachers didn't have access to that. So I pushed to challenge that very, very hard. At the end of the day, does every teacher's test score need to be in a newspaper? I'm not sure if it does. And I worry that teacher morale is very, very tough now, and I know everyone may not agree with me. I think we have to uplift and strengthen the teaching profession, and I'm not sure if that moves us in the direction we need to go. But the big thing for me is having teachers have access to that information. And then we should talk about whether they're the parent of the students or whatever. But the big
Is this a change? Because originally you supported releasing it in Los Angeles.
I think the facts have changed. Again, what I was trying to break through is where this data existed and you couldn't get into the hands of teachers in L.A. That was the part that was crazy to me. The only way the system wouldn't do it, so it had to come from the outside. I mean, that sounds crazy, but that was reality. Now that's changed. The teachers in L.A. have actually a very thoughtful way of getting to the teachers now and now giving them feedback and helping them learn. So the crisis or the craziness that I was facing a couple years ago has gone away. So it's a different situation. And the big thing for me is to empower teachers. This isn't about gotcha. It's about what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, how am I improving every single year, how do we have meaningful professional development that actually helps teachers. So much of our PD for teachers is just an absolute joke and a waste of their time. We've got to move into a system of continuous improvement. I think we're starting to aim in that direction.
Okay, so would you share the information with everyone or just with the parents, perhaps?
So I'm more absolutely with the teachers and principals, and I think we should have that conversation about potentially sharing it with the parents, but I don't see a huge compelling need to publish everyone's information in the newspaper when the teachers actually have access to it themselves, which I think is the most important thing.
Okay, John King, it's being debated in Albany. Should it be shared only with the parents or only with the teachers? Should it be public?
So I don't think publication in the newspaper is helpful. Obviously there'll be a conversation in Albany, I think a focused conversation over the next few weeks about the role potentially of parent release. To me, one of the dangers of publication in the newspaper, and one of the things you saw play out in the last few months, is that it has the effect of boiling down the evaluation system to that single measure, which no one is for. Right? You can't find a researcher or a policy expert who's making the argument we should evaluate teachers on test scores alone. Now, we all believe in multiple measure system. Now, people may have different views on what weight to put on different factors, but all of us believe in multiple measures, and the law we have in New York State places the majority of weight, 60%, on the administrator's observation of the teacher's practice and other tools like surveys of parents and students, right? 20% on a locally selected measure, which could be a different assessment than the state test, and then 20% on the state test. But the publication in the newspaper has the effect of focusing all of the attention on just one portion of the measure, which clearly is problematic.
So you wouldn't let the press publish?
So no, I do not think it should be published. To be clear, I don't think publication is helpful. I don't think publication in the press is helpful.
Okay.
Because the goal ultimately is better student learning and better professional development to get us there.
Chancellor?
I am not making any new news today. So I've been very public about this. It should be public. And again, I think what I've said publicly also is that I believe in my workforce. I have 75,000 teachers that I'm responsible for. And I feel very strongly about teachers not being denigrated, not using the newspaper to do that. But from a public point of view, I think it should be public. But at the same time, I hate the discussion when it tries to have the 10 worst or 10 best. I think that defeats the whole purpose that the Secretary and the Commissioner are talking about. But at the same time, it's public information that should be out there. And I think we need to have this type of discussion to elevate it. And quite frankly, I think once this discussion has been had, then it fades away. And the discussion then matures and it evolves to a more refined system that allows us to have this type of healthy discussion. But I resent folks being denigrated as a result of this process.
I think it's quickly, I think it's a really, it's a fascinating conversation, lots of different points of view, but I really try to struggle, what are our goals? I think there are a couple goals, and ideally the goals aren't sort of in conflict with each other, mutually reinforcing. I think the biggest goal is to help strengthen the teaching profession and help teachers and principals in schools improve. That's a hugely primary goal. The second one, I have a fourth grader and a second grader in public schools, and luckily in a fantastic school, and I think you really want to empower parents. So those are your two primary goals. And I think as a parent, I want information in terms of how my school or my potential school is doing. I don't necessarily need information about every individual teacher. I'm not picking a school based upon a teacher. I am basing it upon a whole set of factors around how that school is doing. So can we empower parents and help strengthen and support teachers? Can you do those two things and not have them be in conflict? I think there's a way to do it thoughtfully that doesn't, in my mind, necessarily mean putting every teacher's score, but having the schools, again, a whole host of measures around the school and around the district, test scores being a piece, but just a small piece, and looking at all these other things. I think the more our parents are empowered to make good choices, that is hugely important, and we haven't begun to do enough of that as a country.
If I can just pick up on that, because I totally agree with the Secretary in that obviously we want parents to have as much information as possible. And I think by providing them a variety of the multiple points that we're talking about, involves that parent more so in what's happening in his or her or their children's school. And I think as the discussion, again, evolves and matures, and even with some of the debate that's taking place, you have a more enlightened, not just parent body, but a public body as well. With a more enlightened public body, there's a greater investment in what's going on in education. And I think part of the challenge has been in getting that message out as far as all that richness that's taking place right now. I think we're in a golden age of changing education like never before. And with Common Core and all that we're talking about allows our educational system to take that really next leap forward. And I think the information that we're talking about, the data points that we're talking about, provide that richness, that discussion, that interaction with the parent body and the public body as far as allowing them to take that next step with us.
A related question on the raising of standards is something that people have wondered. What do you do about special education students, English language learners, as you raise the standards and everybody has to take a richer or deeper series of tests or assessments, whatever you want to call it, do we run the risk of making it harder for some students to graduate, and what do you do to accommodate them? I know that New York State is looking into multiple pathways of graduation. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So then there are two things. One is we've got to make sure that we improve instruction. Right? It's sort of like if you just raise the bar higher and say, here, jump over this higher bar, that alone is not going to work, right? So at the end of the day, we've got to have a strategy to help teachers teach more effectively, whether it's struggling students who are behind academically or students with disabilities or English language learners. And so one of the things we're doing with some of our Race to the Top resources is putting those resources into curriculum materials and videotaping grade instruction and tools to help teachers get better at instruction, because ultimately that's what's going to advance student achievement. That said, in addition to an achievement gap, I think we have an engagement gap in a lot of our schools and around our country generally. So you have high school students who are not motivated about school, they don't come, they don't engage with their academics, they struggle, and the question is, how do you provide them a pathway that is meaningful? I was in a school just outside of Syracuse, in East Syracuse, and a student was talking about why he loves automotive class. And he said, I love cars. My favorite thing about school was second period, because that's when we were working. They were building a Cobra, which is a fancy car, clearly. They were building a Cobra in his automotive class, and he said that was his favorite thing about school. But this is a kid who also took AP Computer Science, and he was thriving academically, but what motivated him every day was automotive class, and he stayed late, stayed till 9, 10 at night to work on this car. And he said, you know, people think it's just about cars, but actually it's about the scientific method. So, you know, in automotive class, what we're challenged with every day is a problem. We've got to figure out how to solve it, and we've got to figure out how to use the tools in front of us to solve that problem. It's fantastic. And in that school, in that high school, what their mindset is, we're going to find the thing that is the hook for every kid. There was a kid who was a student with disabilities who runs their credit union. They have an actual credit union in the school, and kids and faculty members deposit money in the school, and the kid manages the credit union. And he's totally excited about it and passionate about it and wants to go on and study finance.
Is he financing the Cobra development?
No, that's an interesting point. It's interesting that you raised that. Their strategy for paying for the automotive shop, which is very elaborate, is that they raffle off the Cobra. So if you guys are interested, I can connect you with the school.
It's probably over the $50 limit.
But our strategy on multiple pathways is that we ought to have graduation requirements that allow students who get engaged around career and technical education to see a pathway to graduation through that career and technical education. For kids who get engaged around STEM subjects, math, science, engineering, to pursue that as their strategy for reaching the graduation requirements, and then to have a more traditional humanities path also available for students. So that's something the board is looking at. The key question for us is how do we ensure that we maintain the rigor, but also bridge this engagement gap?
Because we've done away with the vocational degrees that used to be awarded in the past, it's harder to get a diploma now. In New York State, you have to have a higher test score on your Regents exams. So that's what some teachers wonder is, are we raising the bar too high? Is it going to make it too hard for certain kids? Because we already have students with learning disabilities and English language learners have the lowest graduation rates.
Let me really just challenge the assumption behind that question. The children we hurt most when we dummy down standards are the marginalized kids, the black and brown children, special needs, the English language learners. And I promise you the best thing we can do to help children at risk is to raise the bar, to have high expectations. And so anyone who thinks we should somehow dummy down things because somehow we're going to coddle kids across the finish line, we do them a grave disservice in the long haul. We have to have the supports, we have to have the extracurriculars, we have to do all those wraparound services, we have to do all those things. But anyone who thinks we shouldn't raise the bar are hurting our kids, our communities, and ultimately our country.
I think what we hear, though, is how are we going to support them?
So that's a really fair question.
Yeah, we have to break down our own barriers. So for New York City, we have screen schools. And screen schools, some of them, won't take in certain populations. It is our responsibility to make sure we're not allowing that to happen. So we've made a major step in telling screen schools they have to take in certain populations, and we'll be watching them do that and holding them accountable for that, and making sure through our phase 1, now phase 2 process with special ed students that they are eligible to go to all schools, and providing the supports to have them go to those schools, and making sure that the system is aware of our expectation as well. I think that goes into the accountability. But I will not accept any type of dumbing down or minimizing or lowering the threshold because a student is X. If anything, we want to make sure we increase the intensity and have the supports there, but also have a discussion about it as well, and making sure that people understand just because you are of color, just because you're SPED, just because you're an L student, doesn't mean you can't qualify and do the work and expectation that we set up for you. And I think that's part of our challenge as a system, to make sure those expectations are cut across not just the teacher workforce, but the administrative workforce as well. I think once we're able to do that, then you will see a lot of movement in that regard. And then also tackling, which the Secretary and the Commissioner are very much involved in, those schools that have not done well, that have been failing these students year after year after year, and dealing with the tough news and all the noise that goes along with it, and saying, if you don't improve by X, you'll be phased down and shut down. And that's part of our responsibility, to make sure we create the new models of schools to meet those demands. I mean, all of us have our own stories. I got my favorite story. At 7:05 in the morning, I live in Queens. I went to Staten Island to visit a school. There was a student at the door, not to greet me, but their school started at 7:30. So I really started pressing the students, saying, you like your school? And they said, yes. I said, okay, tell me why you like your school. This was a 16-year-old. And he said, I like the curriculum. And I said, this is a 7-year-old child. I said, you like the curriculum? What about the curriculum do you like? And this guy, he wasn't like trying to set up. He was being sincere. He said, I love earth science. I said, what do you like about earth science? He said, I love my teacher, and I love the study of Earth's core. And then he started breaking down the core of the Earth and what he's getting at. There are schools that are out there that are just able to reach these students, whether they're SPEDs, whether they're Ls, whether they're students of color, it doesn't matter. Those are the types of schools all of us want in the system, and not having schools, for whatever reason, that have not met that threshold of expectation of delivering for all students.
I'm just going to provide a translation. SPED is an acronym.
I'm sorry, I'm in this audience, so special education
students.
and English language learning. I'll provide that.
That raises a question that I did want to ask, which is, you brought up the issue of closing schools, and you have talked about closing the dropout factories and getting rid of the bottom 5% of schools nationally, closing them. There are school improvement grants, and right now there's been a controversy in New York City about the closing of schools. Communities get very anxious, frustrated. Chancellor, you've heard every adjective in the book by now when a school is closed. And so I guess the question is, can school improvement grants be used to help schools before they get to the point where they need to be closed?
That's where the overwhelming majority of our dollars are being spent around the country. And obviously there's some current tensions here in New York City. I don't want to minimize that, but I'll just say the first year of data for these school turnaround grants around the country has blown me away. It's pretty extraordinary how many schools have seen double-digit increases in reading, double-digit increases in math, graduation rates going up, 10, 12, 14 points, dropout rates going down, huge reductions in violence. Just to challenge the media a little bit, the fact there's been so little controversy nationally, over 1,000 schools being turned around, folks, union management, community, all rolling up their sleeves and just doing extraordinarily tough but critically important work. It's been a wildly underreported story due to the relative lack of controversy. Now, there's been obviously some noise here in New York, but if you look across the nation, no, that's okay.
But you're talking about,
and you'll get there, I have every faith. But
you're talking about the improvements that are working with schools that don't involve closing them.
Again, there isn't one model. So what we say is that
because the word turnaround is used rather loosely, but you actually have different models.
Different models. We say we don't know what's best for any community. The community does. What's not acceptable is the status quo. This is not about incremental change. This is about fundamental, transformational change. And that's going to look very differently community by community, urban, rural, suburban, all kinds of different contexts. But given that flexibility, communities have not only chosen wisely, they have executed and implemented in pretty extraordinary ways. And I think that's a story, again, that the national media hasn't fully comprehended. None of these schools are where we want them to be, long way to go. But to see that much progress in a year, very few people thought that was possible. Lots of skeptics thought that was impossible. And guess what? It's happened.
So, Chancellor, I guess my natural follow-up for you then is, are you emulating the programs that Secretary Duncan is talking about right now?
Well, we have a lot of successful work taking place in New York City. I mean, we have a number of our schools that we've created over the last 9 years that are doing extremely well as a result of phasing out a number of schools and the creation of new schools that are outperforming those schools that have been there before. We have people, believe it or not, you know what the news for today? Sometimes the union and the administration and management are working together. When we talk about the 18D committees in staffing a number of the schools, there are 18D committees that are committees of both management or teachers and the union representative working on the hiring that's taking place in these new schools. The ones that we've been reading about in the newspaper over the last couple of months, I mean, again, it hasn't been totally approved, but we have 24 18D committees right now gearing up and looking at staff who will go into these new schools. We've identified tentative leaders for these new schools. People are excited, believe it or not. We have a number of applications of people who are interested in working in these schools. And we have a proven success model in New York City. We've created 535 new schools in New York City over the last 10 years, larger than most systems in the country itself. And of those, we have a variety of choice options for our families to choose from, whether it's single-sex schools, charter schools, small schools, large schools. Those are great things going on. And believe it or not, it's as a result of cooperation with the union. We'll fight, will go to court, go through arbitration, it'll be covered in the newspapers, but all the good work that the Secretary talks about that's taking place, unfortunately, is not covered, but it's happening throughout the city. So I'm very proud of our work here and looking forward to the next phase of our work because our work is not done and we still have many tough battles in front of us. But our bottom line has to be focused on the students, and it's worth the yelling, it's worth the fights, it's worth the one-finger salutes. I mean, that doesn't matter because if this goal is to improve education outcome, making sure our students are college and career ready, that's worth the battle. And I'm up for it, and the mayor's up for it, and we're ready to take on that type of engagement because it benefits us in the long run.
Well, one thing that, we've been hearing and which the members of this organization had asked me to ask you all about is that New York City now has 1,700 public schools, including over 100 charter schools. There's a lot of innovation going on, but how much are the schools learning from each other? For example, you can go into a building and have 4 different schools, and there may be one charter there may be a couple of regular schools in the building, and they may not always be talking to each other. And Chancellor, you've heard cases at public hearings where children said to you, I feel badly, I feel like a second-class citizen because the charter schools seem to have better facilities, or those kids seem to have it better than me. How do you ensure that if we're going to be encouraging innovation with federal dollars, with state dollars, that everybody does learn from each other, and what accountability do you put in to make sure that that's taking place? That's
really a great question, in that we have seen, I think, the growth of our building councils within shared space. And we've seen, I think, in New York City, a maturation of those councils where there is a lot of collaboration, but still the work is far from done. And I think our challenge is still to break the wall between the non-charters and the charters. And I think, believe it or not, even with the noise, there's a lot of dialogue taking place. And I think the second-class citizen label, we've tried to make sure we address that in a variety of ways, both through the capital funding, so make sure that if one particular school, whether it's a charter school or non-charter, has capital, the others benefit as well, and that's part of law, but that's also part of resource allocation. So we're doing it in that regard. But also when it gets to a district level, trying to facilitate the interaction between charters and non-charters in all the schools. And then the other thing, especially for those that are non-charter schools, through the networks and through our team development, we incorporate that. One final note, so from a leadership point of view, this coming Saturday, I'll be hosting our second gathering of leaders from across the system. So probably 1,800 principals will be gathering at Brooklyn Tech. You're welcome to come. They won't be yelling at me this time. And it's about learning. It's about professional development, and that's another way through PD and making sure we're breaking down those barriers between the various schools so people can feed off of each other. So last year we had both David Comer as well as Charlotte there. And it was a lovely, engaging.
Those are people involved in training teachers.
And Common Core. And as a result of that, a number of the principals left learning from each other, learning from the small groups, and really incorporating what they heard from their peers. So we're working very hard through our team to break down those walls so there are interactions taking place throughout the system.
So I think the foundation world wants to know, how do they know which programs are really working and are worth supporting? What data do you use? Could each of you quickly answer that, please? Because I know I'm trying to move through all the questions people have given me.
Our graduation rates going up, our dropout rates going down, and are more students graduating from high school, college, and career ready? If the answer is yes, that's a good investment. If the answer is no, you need to invest your dollars someplace else.
The other thing I would add that is we increasingly have the ability to track students into higher education and post-secondary. By next fall, with as part of our state data system, every principal, high school principal in the state will get a Where Are They Now report modeled on work that New York City has been doing with CUNY that will tell principals how their graduates are doing at CUNY, and independent colleges and universities through national clearinghouse data. So we'll actually know how many students ended up in remedial courses. Are students persisting in college? And so we'll have that additional layer of measures to inform the decisions alongside what the Secretary described.
Are you developing new models that really engage students? So, for example, you mentioned earlier around career technical education. I know CTE, career technical education, is something that's extremely important for all of us, and what it actually means and how we're incorporating that through the system. Developing new models of schools to attract students, whether they're 9 through 14 models, so you graduate with an associate's degree like some of the schools we have, or tying into the new technology and the new 21st century type of careers that are out there and developing those types of schools. I think that type of investment pays off in the long run, and I think also taking a look at, for me especially, and all of us, the role of the parents and how they're engaged in knowing the information and making sure they have various vehicles of learning what's going on in their child's school. And I think those are measures to take a look at as far as performance is concerned, but also the engagement part of the system with philanthropy as far as their investment of dollars.
I think another question was about how much autonomy principals have these days, because New York City no longer has the very strong districts that it used to have years ago with district superintendents working by region geographically. Principals have a lot of autonomy now, and some of them are very adept at partnering with foundations or organizations and getting grants, especially if they're experienced. Other principals may be quite new at that. Some principals hire grant writers. So what's your advice to principals in terms of how they can partner with organizations and learn how to get the right fit?
Obviously, it's no brainer they should do that, but let me just take a step back. I have the joy of going to hundreds and hundreds of schools around the country. I've yet to go to a great school that doesn't have a great principal. I keep looking for it. I can't find it. In education, like business, like philanthropy, like nonprofits, leadership matters tremendously. And our principals are CEOs today. They're managing people. They have to be instructional leaders first and foremost. They're managing multi-million-dollar budgets. They're managing facilities. They're working with the community. Whatever we can do to train our principals in that array of very, very complex skills, including how to network with the community and foundations. Not everyone is born doing that or has those relationships, but there's nothing more important than getting a great principal into every school. If we do that, so many of the challenges we talk about go away. Great principals attract and retain great talent. Bad principals are threatened by that talent and run them off. So what are we doing systemically to help principals get ready to enter that extraordinarily important job, and how do we help them develop throughout their career? That's a big, big deal. Frankly, it's an area where I think our department's been part of the problem. I think we've underinvested there, and we're trying in very tough budget times, looking for substantially more money from Congress to put behind principal leadership and development, because I don't think we've done enough to help them.
I think that's right, and one of the things we're doing in New York is changing how we certify principals and changing what the standards are for principal certification. One of the things we'll build into the certification is observing a teacher and giving feedback, which is something that we think is core to the principal's work, but is actually missing from a lot of administrative certification programs. There's a lot of focus on operational tasks, but not necessarily as much focus on the instructional leadership that principals need to be providing. So we're working on that. One thing I would say on the principal autonomy issue is, to me, it's a question of, is it autonomy with the right level of support, right? And I know New York City is thinking about this. Districts around the state are thinking about, how do we make sure that principals have access to great resources to help their teachers get better at teaching? How do we make sure principals have access to great resources around how to make the Common Core a reality in their buildings? How do we help principals identify which teachers are most effective in their buildings and which aren't? And so you need those supports. Otherwise, autonomy without support can sometimes result in folks feeling lost.
Chancellor, do you go on?
No, and I think that goes directly into the management of one's budget as well. I shouldn't be micromanaging the principal's budget. I should set the overarching goals and expectations and the certain deliverables that I want to see achieved, obviously. But at the same time, the principal knows better what is in her or his building as far as how to use that budget. So the supports that John talks about as far as making sure you have the supports there through budgets and having potential rollover dollars, what it means there. But the other thing that I think is so key, and this is where philanthropy has played a very important role for us in New York City, is leadership pipeline. Having a pipeline in place to develop the new generation of leaders as well, and what that actually means. And philanthropy has been outstanding in supporting us in New York City along that line, along with Common Core and other areas as well. But having a leadership pipeline, to me, goes a long way. I want a strong principal. People, before I got this job last year, people said, what do you plan to do when you're no longer deputy mayor? And I've always said, I would love to be a principal in the toughest school that's underperforming with some of the toughest communities and turn that school around. That, to me, is where the action really is. And John has been a principal. Arne, were you a principal?
No.
Okay. No. And I mean, that to me is where the rubber really meets the road, because they have a tough job. They're everything that Arne told, they're the managers, they're the CEO, they're the social worker, they're the pedagogical leader, they're everything. And to me, That's a great thing to have, and to have a pipeline in place, just like with baseball. You have your minor league, and when the minor league folks are ready, they go into the big leagues. I want to have that farm team ready, so that way as we develop new schools, develop new positions, or for whatever reason we lose a principal, depending on whatever the reason might be, I have people out there ready to step into that principal role, step in to be the assistant principals, and drawing them not just from teacher ranks, but drawing them from non-traditional ranks as well, because they can be great leaders. I want leaders of buildings. I want motivators. I want people who know how to engage. I want smart thinkers. I want pedagogical brains there, and also want you to be able to surround yourself with the talent to give the supports that John talked about, and knowing how to draw in the resources and work for public schools, as well as through their own means in drawing the other support aside from city tax levy money as well.
Because that also leads to an issue of equity, right? If a principal isn't well trained, or if a principal doesn't know which groups to work with, then some schools are going to end up with more resources than others. I work also with Schoolbook, which is our website between WNYC and the New York Times, and we've had a series this week on the role of parent fundraising. There are schools where parents can pull in $1 million a year for extras, and then there are schools where they can't raise anything. So how do you solve the issue of equity then?
It's a huge challenge. You're raising great questions, and obviously so much of funding in this country comes at the local level, as you know. About 8 to 10% comes from us, half comes from the state, and 40% comes at the local level. And when I ran Chicago Public Schools, I had got less than half the money of districts 5 miles north of me. My population was 90% minority, 85% poor. My children needed more, not less. And the disparities, in my state and here in other places are absolutely stark. And when you look at high-performing nations, it's interesting. They actually spend less per pupil than we do, but they do a much better job of equalizing opportunity and making sure that kids who have the least get the most. So I'm going to take one more step. It's not dollars are hugely important. As important or related is what do we do to get our hardest working, our most committed, our most talented teachers and principals to the children who need the most help. And systemically, we have done a horrendous job of this as a country. This is what part of the school turnaround is trying to challenge. If we systemically got our most committed, our hardest working teachers and principals to those underserved communities, we'd see some of these cities' achievement gaps disappear overnight. But we pay them worse. We don't give them the supports. It's not the badge of honor. And I always give the example, when the president wanted to go after Osama bin Laden, he didn't send a bunch of rookies in. He sent in the Navy SEALs. He sent in the best of the best, the most talented, the most trained, the most committed, and they did an amazing job. Why would we do anything less in our school system? I don't understand that.
So then just to pick up on what you said, if you're talking about these other services that other countries provide, which help lead to a more educated population, what would be the role then of private foundations? Should they invest in helping the schools, or should they invest in early childhood education, daycare, all the things that we know make a difference for children before they even go to school?
The hard answer is yes, yes, and yes.
Not to put you on the spot.
No, if I could say three things, again, first I'll just appreciate the tremendous commitment. There's just sort of three ideas of what's the right role for philanthropy. One thing we haven't talked enough, I think, is the importance of state policy. In Plain and Albany, and again, states drive education. And when you have state laws on the books that hurt kids and hurt education, that can't be allowed to happen.
Like which?
There are all kinds of state laws that are, so whether it's tremendous inequities or laws that don't respect the teaching profession, whatever it might be, those are big challenges. So making sure you have policies in place that are raising the bar and driving folks in the right direction, that's one. Secondly, again, we sort of touched on, I think it's this idea of return on investment. I'm actually not coming here to ask you to give a lot more, although that would be great too, but to be really smarter in what you're giving, and are you making a difference? And it's so funny, I talk to big CEOs and talk about bottom line, and I say, what's your bottom line in your philanthropic giving? And they often sort of, man, I never really thought about that. And so really, are you making a difference? There's great early childhood programs, and there are terrible early childhood programs. Quality matters. Implementation matters. Understanding, are your dollars closing those gaps or not? The third area I just encourage folks to think about is the biggest challenge I think we all face is that we're all told we're going too fast, when in fact we are going far, far, far too slow. The world is passing us by. And whatever you guys can do to help create greater demand among parents, among constituents, among the public, take out politics, Republican, Democrat, Independent, I could care less. if a lot more folks were talking about what is this political leader, the mayor, the governor, the president, whoever, what are they really doing for education? But we don't have enough people knocking down any of our doors saying you're not getting better fast enough. I wish I had a lot more of that pressure. I get zero of that. I think that's a big, big problem.
So very quickly, lightning round. Which three things could government fund that would make the biggest difference in education? Start with you, Chancellor.
A government could fund to make a big difference. I think taking a look at the ability to distinguish salaries for teachers. I think, to me, that's a very big motivator as far as taking a look at some of the need areas and how we do that. That's one. I think taking a look at the investment in our schools and making sure that our schools are investing their dollars wisely, and that means making sure that principals have flexibility and allowing those dollars to generate the type of momentum that we're talking about and the accountability that's there. I think the third thing to me would be to take a look at the capital needs of schools as well. I mean, we haven't talked about capital, but I think capital is extremely important. We've made a major investment in New York City as far as the infrastructure is concerned. And, this current capital budget is $11.2 billion. Since the mayor has been in office, we have built close to 100,000 new seats, and we've made major investments in the capital infrastructure of our schools. And that helps our schools to keep pace with the new technology as well. So I think from a greater flexibility around funding structures for salaries, taking a look at, I can go on now. So we talked about the bonus initiative as well, and trying to recruit the best talent and allowing us to have flexibility and saying that we're going to have a $25,000 loan write-off for our teachers, and government provides that. Unfortunately, we need union sign-off to do that. So those are the types of investments, I think, attracting the best talent here and allowing that talent to stay.
Commissioner, your top three?
Early childhood education. We just as a country, I think, are terribly underinvesting in early childhood education despite a mountain of research that suggests that that's one of the best things we can invest in to have kids be successful in school. Second is equity in school finance. We need to look very hard at how we organize, how we fund our schools. The reliance on property taxes is very high, not just in New York, but around the country. And as a result, we just see extraordinary inequities. And then the third is, both at the high school level and at the college level or post-secondary level, programs that help students make the transition, right? So whether it's career and technical education programs at the high school level or early college high school programs at the high school level that help kids see the relationship between what they're doing in high school and a future beyond it, or once kids get to the post-secondary level, supports that they're successful. We have some very successful bridge programs that provide summer supports or counseling and tutoring for students who are first-generation college-going students. Their graduation rates are dramatically higher than similar students without those supports. And so it's really funding on both the high school side and the post-secondary side to make sure that students make that transition successful.
Secretary Duncan?
So obviously there are different funding roles at the local and the state and the federal level, and ideally those are all in sync, and too often they're not. So I'll just try and speak at the federal level. Absolutely agree on the early childhood piece. Again, that's the area where historically we haven't played. Past 2 years we've done $630 million. We're in this for the long haul. It's the best investment we can make. Why do governments cut it? Because young kids don't have lobbyists and young kids don't vote, and they don't have political power. And so that's something this type of audience needs to work on. Secondly, supporting vulnerable populations. We're always going to put a huge amount of money, Title I for poor children, special needs money, English language learners. We got to help kids that don't have all the opportunities. Third, obviously, we haven't talked here in the audience, but the higher ed piece is so important, keeping college affordable, accessible. That's a big challenge, but maybe the thing I'm most proud of is an additional $40 billion in Pell Grants that we've put out there without going back to taxpayers for a nickel, gone from 6 million to 9 million recipients. The final piece, which is different at the federal level, that I think is hugely important, it's controversial on both sides of the aisle, is us funding innovation and best practices and having competitive dollars. I think I can make a pretty good case that Race to the Top and I-3 and Promise Neighborhoods have had an inordinate impact on education reform in this country. But we're only able to do that if we're not restricted to formula money, if we have some money to compete out, to scale up best practices, and to replicate what is working.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth. 4 things very quickly. Number 1, it's nice to know muscle cars has a role in school reform. Number 2, there's one other leader in the education reform arena that is here in the auditorium, and I really want to acknowledge her. Dr. Merrill Tisch, the Chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents, is here. Can we say hello to Dr. Tisch? Okay. Number 3, there is a reception right behind you, so please join us for a glass of wine and have a nosh or two. And finally, thank you, Brandy, and the staff here at City for hosting us. We really appreciate that. Beth, thank you for leading a civil conversation and a discussion. It was really terrific. And most of all, I really want to thank them taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us, Secretary Duncan, Commissioner King, and Chancellor Walcott. Thank you very much. It is exactly 6:30. The 33rd Annual Meeting of Philanthropy New York is now officially adjourned. Thank you. Have a good night.